how exactly did a fairly comfortable middle-class student named Vladimir Ulyanov capitalize on a crumbling empire to become Lenin, the literal architect of the world's first communist state? It is a wild story of radicalization, strict ideology, and just absolute ruthless pragmatism.
All right, let's look at the roadmap for today. The spark of radicalism, forging a new ideology, the October coup, consolidating absolute power, and finally, Lenin's totalitarian legacy. Part 1. The spark of radicalism.
To really wrap our heads around Lenin's extreme endgame, we've got to look at the world he was born into. Late 19th century Russia was a literal powder keg. While places like Britain and France were rapidly modernizing, the Russian Empire was stuck in the past. You had authoritarian rule by the Tsars, an incredibly backward rural economy, recently emancipated serfs still living in crushing poverty, and a deeply conservative Orthodox church keeping a tight lid on the social order. It was an incredibly volatile mix.
Now, you might think Lenin was born into that crushing poverty, but young Vladimir actually had a pretty comfortable upper-middle-class childhood. But then, boom, in 1887, his older brother Alexander is executed for his role in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. This shattering event just completely destroyed his idyllic childhood. It was the absolute turning point that triggered his descent into extremist politics. After this, he would never be the same. Moving right along to Part 2, forging a new ideology.
Unsurprisingly, Vladimir was quickly expelled from university for protesting and eventually exiled to Siberia. But rather than silencing him, that isolation just fueled an incredibly intense period of ideological development. And there's a fascinating bit of irony here with the name Bolsheviks. In 1903, the Russian communist movement split. Lenin led a hardline faction that only wanted dedicated revolutionaries. They were actually the smaller, more radical group. But thanks to a technical voting victory on an editorial board, Lenin boldly branded his followers the Bolsheviks, which literally means majority. This left the actual larger, moderate group stuck with the name Mensheviks, or minority. Talk about a PR masterclass. Here's where things get wild ideologically. Lenin started twisting traditional Marxist theory to fit his own needs. Orthodox Marxism basically said, look, society has to gradually transition through a capitalist bourgeois democracy before it can ever reach a socialist revolution. But Leninism argued the exact opposite. A state could skip that democratic phase entirely and jump straight from autocracy to socialist revolution. This pivot was absolutely crucial because, well, Russia simply didn't have a developed capitalist democracy. Lenin literally had to rewrite the rulebook to force a revolution in his own country. So how exactly do you force a revolution out of thin air? Enter what Lenin called the vanguard of the proletariat. In his 1902 work, What is to be Done, he argued that everyday workers were never going to just spontaneously start a communist revolution on their own. They needed to be led. They required a dedicated, highly organized, and armed vanguard party to violently guide them to communism. This hardcore belief was only cemented by the events of 1905. A massive revolution swept across Russia, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to promise a parliament, called the Duma. But almost immediately, the Tsar backtracked, disbanded the assemblies, and brutally crushed any political dissent. For Lenin, this bloody failure proved once and for all that compromising with the Tsar was literally impossible. It sent him right back into years of nomadic European exile. Which brings us to Part 3, the October coup.
The massive opportunity Lenin was waiting for finally arrived, but it wasn't from within Russia. It was a global catalyst, World War I. The outbreak in 1914 was an absolute disaster for the Russian Empire. It crippled their supply lines. The catastrophic military failures and widespread starvation at home created this immense social unrest. Things got so incredibly bad that Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne in March 1917. The Romanov dynasty was finished, creating the perfect political vacuum.
Now, this next part sounds like something straight out of a movie. In April 1917, the German government, who were actively at war with Russia, actually sends Lenin back to Russia in a sealed train. Their goal? They're hoping this well-known extremist will destabilize the Russian state and take them out of the war. Lenin happily utilizes this enemy train to get back to Petrograd and immediately starts rallying the workers' councils, the Soviets, against the fragile new provisional government. And I want to be clear here, this was not some spontaneous, romantic uprising of the people. It was a highly tactical, calculated coup led by Lenin and Leon Trotsky. Step 1. Arm militias in Petrograd and Moscow. Step 2. On October 25th, rapidly occupy key government and communication buildings. Step 3. March into the Winter Palace and simply remove the provisional government from power. It was procedural, swift, and brutally effective.
So they're in power. What now? Well, to secure their grip, the Bolsheviks initially rolled out some incredibly idealistic promises. They issued a Declaration of Rights for minority self-determination. They passed a decree on land to redistribute massive noble estates directly to the peasants. They brought in an 8-hour workday and completely separated church and state. It was a brilliant, classic political playbook. These highly liberal promises successfully won over the massive agrarian population well before the stark reality of communist rule actually set in.
All right, part 4, consolidating absolute power. Here is where we see those liberal promises completely evaporate. The reality of retaining power during a time of immense national vulnerability was brutal. Just look at the sheer chaos of this timeline. December 1917, they established the Cheka secret police. By March 1918, Lenin asked to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, giving up vast amounts of prime Russian territory to Germany just to exit World War I. August 1918, Lenin barely survives an assassination attempt. And all through 1918 to 1920, their new Red Army is fighting a desperate, incredibly bloody Russian civil war. To survive this absolute crisis, Lenin's government unleashed extreme state violence. The Cheka initiated what became known as the Red Terror. They executed thousands of perceived enemies of the state without trial and sent countless others to Siberian labor camps. It was ruthless. In the military, Leon Trotsky even set up blocking units, literal squads positioned behind their own lines to gun down any Soviet soldiers who tried to retreat. It was a horrific machine, but it was deployed specifically to ensure the survival of their new regime.
And you have to remember who they were fighting. The White Army wasn't just one group. It was a massive, fractured coalition of enemies. You had elements of the old Russian military, the aristocracy, the Orthodox Church, moderate leftists who absolutely hated Lenin's dictatorship, and even international forces from Britain, France, and the USA. Yet, against all odds, the Red Army systematically crushed this entire domestic and international coalition, securing the Soviet state by the end of 1920. But the prize for winning was a completely ruined, starving country. And here we see another fascinating pivot from Lenin. In 1921, to prevent total economic collapse, he introduces the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This actually allowed for limited free markets and private ownership. Even as the staunch, hardcore Marxist, Lenin was pragmatic enough to literally hit pause on strict ideology and use capitalism as life support for the economy.
And finally, part 5, Lenin's totalitarian legacy. To understand the dark political architecture he ultimately left behind, we have to look at Lenin's sudden physical decline. The immense stress of the revolution plus the lingering wounds from being shot just utterly ruined his health. By 1922, he suffers the first of multiple strokes that leave him partially paralyzed. So it's a crazy irony. Right as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is officially stamped into existence, its chief architect is physically incapacitated and basically sidelined from power until his death in 1924. Realizing the end was near, Lenin actually dictated a final testament where he explicitly warned the party against Joseph Stalin, saying he was far too ambitious and dangerous. He wanted Leon Trotsky to succeed him. But Stalin just completely ignored this. In the political chaos right after Lenin's death, Stalin brilliantly outmaneuvers Trotsky, forms alliances within the Politburo, and eventually locks in an absolute brutal dictatorship. Now, people love to debate this point. Lenin wasn't Stalin, right? Sure. But look at the literal totalitarian blueprint Lenin left behind for him. He created a lethal secret police that just replaced the Tsar's Okhrana. He brought back political exile to Siberian labor camps, and he completely eliminated democratic assemblies in favor of exclusive one-party rule by the Politburo. Whether he intended to or not, Lenin deliberately built the exact oppressive security state that allowed Stalin to thrive. Which leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question directly from our source material. If Lenin had lived longer, do you think a more benign Soviet Union would have emerged under his new economic policy, or would he have ultimately become just as oppressive and totalitarian as Stalin? It's an absolutely wild debate that fundamentally shapes how we view the 20th century. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the past, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next